let's say, maybe together with the Baltic states, 2004. So, what would have been the problem of the Russian citizen? So, in the worst case, CIA would have put their bases in Ukraine, and they would have put pressure on Russia so that Russia would maybe give way to what Brzezinski wanted. So Brzezinski was the main military advisor of the US government after Kissinger, and he wanted to dismember Russia into 3 republics. So European Russia, Siberian Russia, East Asia, Asian Russia. Okay, so this would be the worst case for Putin. So there would be no big Russia like today, but 3 different republics. So then, I guess those 3 republics would not have had any imperial ambition, would not have thought to become a world superpower. That is, instead of having 5 to 10% of GDP for the military, they would have used it for, say, education, health, natural environment. Would it be so bad? I don't think so. I think that for the normal citizen, it would have been great if Russia would have become a non-military state. No? So I think for the so this is for the worst case. Of course, if we have cases that are not so bad from the perspective of Putin, then even better. And then let's look at the other issue, the issue of that the Russian minority, that is a very large minority in Ukraine, 1/3 of the population speaks Russian as a first language, spoke. They wanted to have, so already before, so it's not just now, but since the beginnings, because it's Ukraine means the country of the border. They are a mix, so it's so historically and geographically they are a mix, so they have huge minorities. They have always had, and it is obvious in every state where we have this kind of issue. We have federations. So in Italy, for instance, the German-speaking population, Südtirol, has a region in their own, Trentino Alto Adige, where they have a lot of rights to speak their own language. They send their representatives to the parliament, much more than in proportion to the population. They have a lot of rights. And the same applies to Val d'Aosta, where the French-speaking population of Italy. So, what was then the problem for the Ukrainian citizens? Why would they have fared so much worse if the Donbass would have become an autonomous region within Ukraine or Crimea, so that maybe they would have blocked also NATO? So what? So there is also this example, I think, far-reaching collective madness going on. So a huge disproportion. So they say that officially, I think they say that more than 500,000 were killed on the Ukrainian side, and I guess that many more have been killed on the Russian side. So thousands of families that have been destroyed. So grief, So not only the millions that have died, but also the millions of relatives, mothers, fathers, spouses that would grieve, devastated, their existence completely devastated for what? So, I think that's enough of a monologue. Yes.
Because they have the long time relationship between each other as alliance. From the perspective of Ukraine, they have the long relationship with each other in the alliance sense.
In Ukraine,
they have the long time relation each other, so that they couldn't they couldn't not be that affected by the counterparts, so to say.
So you mean they had a lot of time, a long time of relations or relationships?
Relationships
between
Ukraine and other countries, near countries, and etc.
Yes. They had a lot of relations, but of course there would have been a lot of issues to solve, because so there is the European Union, there is NATO, and there is the international military alliance that is being led by Russia. So, but these are all, I think, issues that can be solved. So these are not so insurmountable obstacles to getting peaceful.
I guess it's because the financial power and financial restraint of the Ukraine as a country, and so that they have not that much sufficient support in their military sense. That's why it's from the country's perspective that Ukraine can only focus on the side like Spitz side, like cannot have the strength in the sense of very large, huge military power against Russia. That's why they have this kind of conflicts each other, but also that they have kind of long-time relationship with other NATO members, for example. That's why, in some extent, that is hard to deal with, but in some good way, yeah.
Yes. However, one should keep in mind that there are very strong cultural ties between Russia and Ukraine. So there are, I think, there have always been a million of people that have relatives on each side of the border, Ukrainians with Russians, and yes, it's. There are also very strong energy issues, also the issues about pipelines going from Russia to Europe, crossing Ukraine, so many issues. One particular aspect of this matter that has not been talked about a lot is the economic development after the end of after independence in Ukraine and Russia. So we saw that the GDP per capita in Ukraine had a disastrous development since after 1991 until today. It has been a disastrous development. So I think that the GDP per capita in real terms today in Ukraine, okay, today it's after the war, is not higher than it was during Soviet times, during the last Soviet years. So it is disastrous. And even before the war started, the GDP per capita in Ukraine was extremely low. There was a negative growth for the first 10 years or so, and then it recovered at a very small pace. In Russia, growth was also negative during the first years, but then it recovered quite strongly, so that GDP per capita today in Russia is much higher than it was in 91 or in 1990. But Ukraine was disastrous, so it was really working very badly already before the war. So to some extent this must be a political failure also, because I think that from the viewpoint of natural resources and human resources, Ukraine is not worse than Russia. But I guess the political environment was not conducive to economic welfare. So, but if you go to the World Bank site and you look at the GDP per capita data, World Bank, then you see that how incredibly bad was the development of GDP per capita in Ukraine already before the war. So,
would it have been bad development, economic development for Russia if Ukraine had joined the EU before, maybe in 2005 or 10, or because maybe then economic relations would have been severed between the two countries, because then Ukraine would have come into the Eurozone and
yes, it would have had some impact, but it is a two-sided, two-edged sword, because yes, of course, if the European Union has barriers, trade barriers to outside Union countries, especially Russia, this would have hurt Russian trade. But on the other hand, it would have been quite natural to improve trade relationship to Russia, because also for Ukraine there are a lot of advantages. So Ukraine would have likely said, well, yes, we like to be part of the European Union, but we would not like to lose trade with Russia, because I guess, I don't know, 1/3 of their trade would be with Russia. So they would say, let us make advantage, how do you call that, and so on. So there are special agreements like with Norway or Switzerland, where they have some special agreements where tariffs are lower. So,
and are you aware of some of the tariffs or obstacles that we, the European Union, have against Russia before the war? So in, I don't know, 2010 or so, what are the barriers that we have?
I guess that they were treated like most other non-EU members, so somewhat tariffs, however, since we get from the Russians, what we got from the Russians was energy, and energy, of course, is important for us if it is cheap. So it was not in our interest to impose tariffs on it. So, and the non-tariff barriers that are very important for international trade, I think they were less important vis-à-vis Russia, because we are not interested in Russian manufactured goods and so on. So they are too bad for us. Low quality.
I just want to mention that, as far as I know, the potential EU agreement with Ukraine did not include any trade barriers for trade between Ukraine and Russia. It's just that Russia threatened economic coercion and decided to violate the Budapest Memorandum by telling Yanukovych to not sign the EU agreement, or like pressuring him into not signing the EU agreement. So I don't think there were any trade barriers.
Yeah, no, it would have been, as I said before, so to speak, the same policy as EU policy towards non-EU countries. But of course, since this country used to trade a lot with Russia, it would have been a problem for them. But I think this was not so important because, as I said before, the Ukrainians themselves, they would have put pressure on the EU to reach some better deal with Russia because they would not like to. Also, simple people crossing the border for work. I think hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian that cross the border to work and live in one side. They used to buy petrol, I think, in Russia, and the Russians came to Ukraine to buy food or something like this. So, and yes, many families also have relatives on both sides. So, and also later on, the Putin and the Russian government did not object to EU membership of Ukraine. So this was secondary. So they only care about NATO membership. So if they enter EU, they will arrange things in some way. It's not an existential threat according to them. So the existential threat is if there is dismembering of Russia because.
But for some reason, still the Russian government or Putin decided to, if the Ukraine gets closer to the EU, that some economic sanctions will be put in place. There was economic coercion threatened for some reason, so apparently the Russian government did see it as a threat, and it's very difficult.
So in any case, the idea of Ukraine in the EU is a very long-term idea. So now, because of the war, they are trying to accelerate on this, but it was one of the most corrupt, it is still, I think, one of the most corrupt country in Europe, maybe the most corrupt country in Europe. And so the rule of the law is very weak. So it didn't satisfy most criteria, so that it was only a process. So it was, yes, we do not want that in 10, 20 years Ukraine becomes the EU.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about membership in Europe. I'm talking about the reason why Yanukovych last minute decided to not sign the agreement to strengthening ties.
Well,
and one part was economic coercion. So for some reason, the Russian government did have a problem with Ukraine, improving their relationship with the European Union. And I'm not talking about membership at all. That wasn't the part of the agreement. So I don't know why precisely Yanukovych did not sign. I know that Russia said that if they would not enter this agreement, they would give a very convenient loan of several billions dollars. So this is more a carrot than a stick. But of course, since they also sold a lot of oil to Ukraine, then the issue of the
bargaining price was an issue. So, but these are normal economic bargainings between every country. So, in any case, there was a possibility to have elections in 2014. So, if the majority would have preferred a pro-European government, they could have just voted for it. So Yanukovych was re-elected president by a fairly democratic election, not less democratic than the other Ukrainian election. So I don't see much of a problem there. So. Okay, so it's getting very late. Then I thank you for your participation in this class over the semester. Thank you a lot for many insightful comments and questions and discussion. And I wish you a lot of success for the exam and success for the rest of your studies.
Thank you.